The gates were locked, but the lights were on. Not one room, not two. The entire upper floor glowed against the winter fog, long after the last heirs had stopped visiting, long after the staff had been dismissed, long after the estate was supposed to be dormant. A mansion that large should not look awake when no one is left to wake it. By morning, the security logs would show movement where there shouldn't have been any. Doors opened and closed, power drawn from circuits officially disconnected. The house had not gone dark when the family did. That was the first mistake no one could undo. It didn't end there. Within weeks, contractors sent to inventory, the property refused to return. One claimed entire rooms had been stripped overnight, paneling removed cleanly, as if by a crew that knew the house better than the blueprint. Another reported furniture repositioned between visits. Heavy pieces moved without leaving marks on the floor. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen, nothing was added. The house was simply being rearranged. By the time the estate's trustees noticed, the cost had already begun accumulating in ways no balance sheet could explain. Security was doubled, then tripled. Still, the lights kept turning on. Still, the rooms changed. Still, the mansion behaved as if it had missed a schedule no one remembered setting. This was not an isolated incident. It was repetition. The same wing, the same floor, always the rooms that once hosted gatherings too large to count and decisions too expensive to reverse. Always after midnight, always stopping before dawn. Whatever was happening respected a rhythm, as if the house were following instruction issued decades earlier. No explanation was offered. None was requested. Everyone involved understood that asking questions would require admitting something had been lost control of. That admission never came. Instead, the trustees did what institutions always do when confronted with something inconvenient but persistent. They treated it as a maintenance problem. Electrical inspection, structural surveys, legal reviews. Each one produced paperwork. None produced answers. The bills grew heavier, the patience thinner, and still the house stayed lit. At some point, the conversations shifted, not publicly, not in writing, quietly, between people who had spent their lives managing assets that outlived the people attached to them. Someone asked when the estate had last been empty. Truly empty. No caretakers, no temporary occupants, no borrowed purpose. No one could give a clear date. That uncertainty mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Because the mansion had not been built to be vacant, it had been designed to operate continuously. Events flowing into dinners, dinners into negotiations, negotiations into obligations that required new rooms, new wings, new expansion. The structure assumed presence. Absence was never part of its logic. When the family withdrew, the house did not follow. That was the question no one asked directly. What happens to a structure designed around permanence when the people who justified it disappear? The answer was not immediate. It arrived in fragments, in costs that made no sense, in delays that compounded without a clear cause, in legal language that grew increasingly careful, increasingly abstract, as if naming the problem too precisely might give it leverage. The estate was still generating expenses, still demanding attention, still exerting influence over schedule, budgets, and decisions made far from its gates. It had outlived the dynasty not by remaining intact, but by remaining active. That was the part no one planned for. The mansion had become the longest-lasting participant in a story that was supposed to end with inheritance. Instead, inheritance stalled, fractured, and eventually dissolved under its weight. Properties were easy to divide. Companies could be sold. Trusts could be dissolved. But this house resisted simplification. Every attempt to repurpose it triggered complications rooted in choices made long before the current stewards were born. Load-bearing walls tied to ceremonial spaces. Utilities routed to accommodate crowds that no longer existed. Hidden rooms whose original function was never recorded because it was never meant to be questioned. The estate wasn't decaying. It was functioning exactly as intended. That realization surfaced too late to be useful. By the time outside observers began to notice, the narrative had already hardened. The mansion was described as abandoned, though it clearly wasn't. It was labeled obsolete, despite continuing to demand resources. It was framed as a relic, even as it continued shaping decisions in the present. The dynasty had ended. The structure had not received the memo, and somewhere in the process, the roles had reversed. The family became a historical footnote attached to the house, not the other way around. Their names were still engraved, still cited, still used to justify delays and exceptions, but they no longer directed anything. The mansion had crossed a threshold few notice until it's behind them. It no longer needed its owners to matter. What followed was not a haunting, not a mystery in the theatrical sense. It was something colder, administrative, structural, a slow realization that the most enduring force in the family's legacy was not a company, not a fortune, not even a name, but a physical object that continued imposing costs long after its purpose had expired. And the most dangerous part was this: the house was still waiting for something, not people, not restoration, not even recognition. It was waiting for the next decision made too late. The problem surfaced quietly, disguised as paperwork. It began with signatures that never arrived, approvals delayed not by dispute, but by absence. Every document required someone who no longer existed in any functional sense. Titles were clear on paper, yet useless in practice. Authority was scattered across trust that had been designed to protect wealth, not dissolve it. The mansion sat at the center of all of them, referenced constantly, resolved nowhere. That delay created its own cost. Maintenance schedules slipped. Repairs became provisional. No one wanted to authorize permanent changes to a property whose ownership felt unfinished, so everything stayed temporary. Temporary fixes layered over temporary fixes until the building became a college of hesitation. Nothing failed all at once. It just never fully worked. What had once been a private residence built to impress guests now required consensus from people who had never stepped inside. Each decision triggered another review. Each review uncovered another clause written for a world that assumed continuity. The dynasty had structured its wealth around endurance. That endurance became the trap. The estate was too significant to sell quickly, too complicated to convert, too symbolic to abandon. Every option carried reputational risk. Selling would look like surrender. Demolition would look like erasure. Preservation demanded money no one felt responsible for spending. So, the house stayed, untouched, yet never idle. It still required heating in winter to prevent damage, still demanded inspections to satisfy insurers who refused to let it quietly fail, still generated invoices that arrived with mechanical indifference long after the reason for paying them had faded. The mansion had become an obligation without a beneficiary. That imbalance warped everything around it. Smaller assets were liquidated to keep it operational. Funds meant for other purposes were quietly redirected. The house exerted gravitational pull, bending priorities toward itself without ever asking permission. What made it worse was memory. Former staff, long dismissed, still referred to rooms by functions that no longer existed. Invitations from decades earlier resurfaced in archives, reminding trustees that the mansion had once been the stage for decisions that shaped entire industry. No one wanted to be the one who closed the door on that, so the door remained open, figuratively, if not physically. At some point, the question shifted from, "What do we do with it?" to, "What happens if we don't?" That question had no clean answer. Allowing decay risked public embarrassment. Intervention risked private conflict. Inaction, paradoxically, felt safer. The estate exploited that instinct. Every year without resolution made the next year more expensive. Deferred repairs multiplied. Systems designed for scale deteriorated faster when underused. The house was too large to rest. It punished neglect with exponential consequences. What had been built to showcase permanence now demanded constant reassurance that it still mattered. And in a way, it did. The mansion had outlived the family not just chronologically, but structurally. It retained coherence where the dynasty fractured. Walls still aligned, foundations still held. The building remembered its purpose even if no one else did. That continuity made it dangerous, because structures that endure beyond their creators stop serving people and start demanding them. The estate required caretakers, lawyers, administrators, roles filled not out of loyalty, but necessity. Each person drawn in became another node in a system that no longer had a center. There were moments when resolution seemed close. Proposals circulated, plans drafted. Each one collapsed under scrutiny, undone by a clause, or a cousin, or a concern that surfaced too late to ignore. The mansion remained untouched, yet deeply entangled. Outside observers mistook the silence for stability. They saw a stately facade, gates closed, grounds maintained just well enough to suggest intention. What they didn't see was the internal paralysis, the inability to move forward, because moving forward required acknowledging that the original logic had failed. The dynasty had assumed succession. The house had assumed presence. Neither accounted for erosion. By the time the idea of repurposing the mansion gained traction, the estate had already redefined the terms. Any new use would need to justify the scale, respect the symbolism, absorb the cost. The building dictated conditions. It had leverage simply by existing. That was the quiet triumph no one celebrated. The family's name still carried weight, but the structure carried inertia. It resisted change not through force, but through complexity. Every attempt to simplify revealed another layer designed to prevent exactly that. The mansion had become the final decision-maker in a lineage that prided itself on control. And control, once lost, rarely announces its departure. It lingers, convincing everyone involved that the situation is temporary, manageable, almost resolved, until the accumulated cost becomes irreversible. That realization was approaching, not dramatically, not with collapse or scandal, with a ledger that no longer balanced. The first real fracture appeared in a place no one visited any. Behind a locked service corridor, past doors that hadn't been opened since the last full staff departure, a section of piping failed quietly. Not catastrophically. No flood, no dramatic damage, just a slow leak that fed into insulation, then into wood, then into a wall whose original purpose had never been documented because it was never meant to be altered. By the time it was discovered, the repair required approvals that took longer than the damage itself. Engineers flagged it. Insurers hesitated. Lawyers requested clarification on responsibility. While they deliberated, moisture did what moisture always does. This became the pattern. Nothing broke loudly enough to force action. Everything failed just slowly enough to spread cost across time and committees. The mansion excelled at this. It converted hesitation into expense with remarkable efficiency. Each repair revealed another dependency. Electrical systems tied to obsolete layouts, structural supports integrated into ceremonial spaces that no one wanted touched. Removing one problem required disturbing three others. The house had been built to resist revision. What no one said out loud was that the estate was no longer being preserved. It was being prolonged. Preservation implies intent. Prolonging implies avoidance. The difference mattered. The longer the mansion remained in this state, the more it shaped the behavior of the people tasked with managing. Decisions were framed around minimizing blame rather than maximizing outcome. Short-term stability replaced long-term clarity. The house became something to survive, not resolve. Even language shifted. Memos stopped using definitive verbs. Restore became stabilize. Convert became evaluate. Sell became explore. The vocabulary of permanence was replaced by the vocabulary of delay. The estate absorbed all of it. Outside, the grounds remained deceptively serene. Trimmed hedges, maintained paths, enough care to suggest stewardship. But beneath that surface, the structure aged unevenly. Some rooms were pristine, untouched by time because no one entered them. Others bore the scars of temporary use. Walls patched, ceilings lowered, original details hidden rather than removed. It was not decay in the romantic sense. It was misalignment. The mansion existed in multiple eras simultaneously, none of them fully acknowledged. Parts of it were treated like a museum, others like an office building, others like a liability no one wanted to inherit. That fragmentation carried a cost beyond money. New personnel rotated through regularly. Each arrived with a mandate to assess. Few stayed long enough to conclude anything. Institutional memory thinned. Decisions were revisited, reconsidered, quietly shelved. The house waited them out. In moments of honesty, some administrators admitted the truth. The mansion had become too expensive to fix and too expensive to let fail. That was the deadlock. Every year without resolution narrowed the range of viable outcomes. What made it worse was comparison. Other properties in the family's portfolio transitioned cleanly, sold, repurposed, absorbed into new functions. They adapted because they had been built for flexibility, or because no one was emotionally invested enough to hesitate. This one was different. The mansion carried symbolism disproportionate to its utility. It represented not just wealth, but the confidence of a period that assumed continuation. Altering it felt like rewriting history. Leaving it untouched felt like honoring it. Neither instinct aligned with reality. Reality, however, was indifferent. Insurance premiums rose, codes changed, standards evolved. The house did not. Each new requirement demanded accommodation from a structure designed under assumptions no longer valid. Compliance became negotiation. Negotiation became expense. At some point, the estate stopped being managed and started being endured. That shift was subtle but decisive. It meant the mansion was no longer an asset under control, but an environment shaping behavior. People worked around it, planned around it, deferred decisions because of it. The dynasty had built the house to demonstrate mastery over land, over resources, over time. What it demonstrated now was something else entirely: how permanence can turn into pressure and purpose disappears. There were suggestions, quietly floated, about partial demolition, removing wings, downsizing the footprint. Each suggestion died quickly, not from opposition, but from complexity. What could be removed without destabilizing everything else? No one could answer with confidence, so nothing was removed. The cost continued to accumulate, not as a single overwhelming figure, but as a steady erosion of options. Every year preserved the past while foreclosing the future. And the house, still standing, still demanding, still shaping outcomes, seemed almost patient. It had learned that time favored it. The decision was framed as temporary. That word did most of the work. Temporary allowed everyone involved to proceed without confronting permanence. Temporary implied reversibility. Temporary suggested respect for the past while postponing commitment to the future. The mansion accepted the word without resistance. The new use did not arrive all at once. It entered through adjustment. Rooms reassigned, entrances redirected, signage added in places never meant to hold it. The original circulation of the house was interrupted, rerouted to serve a function its designers never imagined but had inadvertently prepared for. Large spaces adapted easily. Smaller ones resisted. What had once been ceremonial became operational. What had been private became supervised. Corridors designed to impress now existed to control movement. The house did not protest. It absorbed the change the way it had absorbed everything else, by accommodating it structurally, if not gracefully. The shift came with promise. This purpose would justify the cost. This function would finally align the mansion's scale with necessity. This role would honor the legacy by keeping the building alive. Alive became the operative word. Because the house was no longer merely standing, it was occupied again. Systems long dormant resumed work. Lights turned on for reasons that had nothing to do with spectacle. Rooms filled not with guests, but with routine. The building, which had suffered from neglect, now suffered from use, and use has its own price. The mansion revealed weaknesses that years of vacancy had hidden. Floors worn unevenly, acoustics that amplified noise meant to be contained, sightlines that conflicted with privacy. Each issue required adaptation. Adaptation required compromise. The compromises accumulated. Original details were covered rather than removed. Temporary walls became semi-permanent. Decorative elements lost relevance and were treated as obstacles. The building's identity blurred, caught between what it had been and what it was now required to be. No one asked whether the house consented to this role. It didn't need to. Its scale made refusal impractical. Once occupied, it dictated conditions simply by existing as it was. The irony was difficult to ignore. The mansion functioned better under strain than it ever had in uncertainty. Occupancy gave it clarity. Purpose returned, even if it was borrowed. The building stopped waiting. But clarity came with exposure. Stories began circulating. Not dramatic ones, not legend, but observation. Certain rooms felt wrong for their assigned tasks. Certain corridors produced discomfort, disproportionate to their dimension. People avoided spaces they couldn't explain avoiding. Administrators dismissed this as adjustment. They had always done so. What they couldn't dismiss was cost. Retrofitting a structure like this required constant negotiation between modern requirements and historic constraints. Every solution introduced a new problem. The house was not designed to be efficient. It was designed to be impressive. Efficiency demanded alteration. Alteration threatened identity. So the building remained caught between eras, performing a function it was never optimized for, supported by systems stretched beyond their original intent. The mansion endured, but endurance was no longer neutral. Time inside the building behaved different. Days blurred. Years passed marked by maintenance cycles rather than milestones. People came and went, leaving behind traces that layered invisibly over older ones. The house absorbed them all. What no one anticipated was how difficult it would be to reverse this phase. Temporary extended. Extensions hardened into precedent. The longer the mansion served this role, the more it reshaped expectations about what it was allowed to be. When discussions resurfaced about future plans, they encountered a new obstacle: memory. Not historical memory, but operational memory. The building had been used this way long enough that alternatives felt disruptive. The mansion had adapted again. It was no longer just an inherited structure or an unresolved liability. It had become an institution in its own right. Its presence justified decisions. Its needs dictated schedule. Its scale normalized compromises that would have been unacceptable elsewhere. The dynasty had lost control decades earlier. Now, even its stewards were constrained by what the building had become. That was the quietest transformation of all. The house no longer needed legacy to survive. It had function. It had justification. It had a role that protected it from the questions that once threatened it. But nothing built on temporary foundations lasts without consequence. The cost was shifting again. Not upward all at once, but sideways, into reputational risk, into structural fatigue, into decisions postponed because resolving them would require admitting that the arrangement was never meant to last. The mansion stood, occupied, and altered, waiting for the next phase. It always waited. The end did not arrive as collapse. No fire, no auction, no dramatic transfer of keys. The mansion reached its final phase the same way it had endured every other one, through exhaustion disguised as continuity. Systems still functioned. Walls still stood. The building appeared stable to anyone passing by, but stability was no longer the same as survival. The role that had once justified the house began to thin. Budgets tightened. Standards shifted again. What had been acceptable under one framework became a liability under another. The mansion, once adaptable through sheer scale, found itself incompatible with expectations that demanded efficiency over symbolism. That incompatibility was structural. Every new requirement forced the same reckoning. Change too much, and the house loses what makes it worth saving. Change too little, and it can no longer serve any purpose that justifies its cost. The balance had always been precarious. Now it was eroding. Plans circulated quietly. Not grand visions, those had failed too many times, but exits, gradual withdrawals, timelines without announcement. The language softened again. Transition, phased disengagement, long-term reassessment. The building had heard this before. What changed was the absence of urgency. No one was trying to save it anymore. They were trying to outlast, hoping time would make the decision for them the way it had before. But time, this time, was not on their side. The mansion had accumulated too much history to be ignored, and too much alteration to be pure. Preservationists argued it had survived worse. Accountants pointed to figures that no longer allowed sentiment. Administrators stood between them, translating permanence into spreadsheets that refused to cooperate. The estate entered a familiar limbo, maintained enough to prevent disaster, neglected enough to ensure decline. The house remained occupied by memory rather than function. And then something subtle happened. The narrative shifted. The mansion was no longer discussed as a future asset or a current burden, but as a story already finished. Language moved into the past tense, even as the structure stood intact. Decisions were justified by what the house had been, not what it could become. That was the moment it truly outlived the dynasty, not when the last heir left, not when control fractured, but when the building ceased to represent a future anyone felt responsible for shaping. It became legacy in the most inert sense, acknowledged, referenced, quietly set aside. The estate had won by endurance, not relevance. Visitors, when allowed, remarked on how solid it still felt, how present, how difficult it was to imagine it ever disappearing. That illusion was part of the problem. The mansion projected permanence while consuming resources like something already obsolete. Eventually, caretaking replaced stewardship. The goal became to keep it from becoming an embarrassment rather than to make it meaningful. That is how institutions prepare to let go without saying so. The house noticed. It responded the only way it could, by persisting. Rooflines held, foundations resisted. The structure refused to offer an obvious excuse for removal. No single failure justified final action. Everything broke just slowly enough to demand attention without forcing resolution. The mistake repeated itself one last time. A decision was postponed because there would always be another year, another budget cycle, another opportunity to reconsider. That assumption that time could still be used was the final inheritance the dynasty passed down, and like everything else, the mansion absorbed it. What remains now is not a ruin, but a question made of stone and wood. A structure that continues to exist because ending it would require more clarity than anyone is willing to claim. The estate outlived the dynasty because it was built to, designed to operate beyond individual, beyond generation, beyond intent. It was never meant to stop. That was the flaw. The people faded, the wealth redistributed, the name lost its authority. But the house remained, demanding attention, shaping behavior, imposing cost, proof that some legacies persist, not because they are maintained, but because they are too complicated to dismantle. No resolution arrives. No lesson closes the story cleanly. The mansion stands where it has always stood, neither alive nor abandoned, neither preserved nor erased. It waits, not for heirs, not for restoration, but for the moment when delay is no longer an option. That moment has not come yet. And until it does, the estate continues doing what it has done longer than anyone involved has been alive. It endures.